The plane descended into Naples just after 9 in the evening, and Gianna Ferretti pressed her forehead against the cold oval of the window and watched the city bloom out of the dark like a bruise turning into light. She had not been here since she was 7 years old. 26 years was a long time to stay away from somewhere that was supposed to be home. But the Ferretti family had a complicated relationship with the word home, the same way they had a complicated relationship with the word Naples, with reverence and with terror, sometimes within the same breath. She remembered almost nothing specific, fragments only. The smell of frying dough from a street vendor near their apartment, the sound of her mother singing something low and wordless in the kitchen while the city hummed outside the window. The particular quality of the light in the late afternoon, how it turned everything amber and ancient, how it made even ordinary ugliness look like a painting. And then there was the night everything ended. But she did not let herself think about that night, not now, not yet. The airport was loud and warm, and Gianna moved through it with the particular efficiency of someone accustomed to emergency rooms, where controlled urgency was its own kind of language. She was 33 years old, tall for an Italian woman, with dark hair she kept pulled back in a knot that was less a style choice and more a reflex. She had her mother's eyes, deep brown with a ring of amber at the centre, and her father's jawline, which was stubborn, and she knew it. She collected her 2 bags from the carousel, one large, one small, both practical, and stepped out into the Naples night. The heat hit her first. Even in late September, the air held a thickness that felt almost physical, layered with exhaust and salt and something ancient she couldn't name. She stood on the curb outside arrivals and breathed it in, and something moved in her chest that she hadn't expected. Not grief, exactly. Not nostalgia. Something older and stranger than either, like recognition. Like her body knew something her mind had long since decided to forget. She had a rental car reserved. She drove it into the city with the confidence of someone who has memorized maps the way other people memorize prayers, through streets that were narrow and theatrical and absolutely indifferent to traffic laws. Naples did not apologize for itself. It simply was, loud and ancient and beautiful and broken. And Gianna found, somewhat to her surprise, that she didn't want it to apologize. The apartment she'd rented was in Chiaia, on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled of coffee and cooking and old stone. It was small and clean, with tall windows that opened onto a narrow street. And when she pushed those windows open, the city poured in immediately, voices and scooters, and somewhere distant, the low percussion of music. She stood at the window for a long time without turning on the lights. She had told herself this trip was research. She was between positions. The emergency medicine department at Columbia Presbyterian had offered her a contract renewal, but she'd asked for 6 months first. Personal leave. They'd been reluctant. She'd been firm. The Ferretti stubbornness, her mother used to say, was the one inheritance that never needed a will. But the truth, the real truth, she was only willing to admit to herself at 9 in the evening with the lights of Naples spreading out below her, was that she was here because her mother had died in March and left behind a box of photographs and a name she'd never spoken aloud while she was living. The name was written on the back of a photograph of 2 young women laughing on a seafront promenade. Elena Mancini, Napoli, 1974. On the back, in her mother's handwriting, my sister. Gianna had not known her mother had a sister. She'd spent 6 months trying to find Elena Mancini in the records from a distance, from New York, with the tools available to a woman who was very good at her job and very focused when she had a problem to solve. She'd found fragments. She'd found enough to know she needed to come in person. She unpacked methodically, hung her white coats, she'd brought two out of habit, in the small wardrobe, and set her medical bag on the shelf above the desk. Old habit. You never knew. She went to bed just before midnight and lay in the dark listening to Naples breathe, and didn't sleep for a very long time. She started work the following Monday. The hospital, Ospedale del Mare, a large modern facility near the eastern waterfront, had been glad to take her on as a visiting physician in the emergency department. Her Italian was perfect. Her mother had insisted on that, had spoken nothing but Italian to her until she was 12, and even after the move to New York, there had been Italian at home always, insistent and intimate, a private language. Her credentials were impeccable. The department head, a large, tired man named Dr. Russo, who had the look of someone who'd seen everything and was still somehow surprised by it, had shaken her hand and said she was heaven-sent because he was down 2 physicians and the football season had just started, and people in Naples took football with a seriousness that regularly resulted in head injuries. "You'll fit in," he said, meaning she was competent. She thought, "I have to." The first week passed in the particular rhythm of emergency medicine, which had no rhythm at all, only an endless present tense. She worked 12-hour shifts and came home and ate whatever was closest and slept and went back. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. The decisive calm, the ability to move fast without moving carelessly, the gift of making frightened people feel, if not safe, then at least attended to. Her patients were fishermen and tourists and elderly women and drunk teenagers and occasionally men with injuries they were vague about the origin of, which was a kind of language she was learning to read in Naples the same way she'd learned to read it in the Bronx. On Friday evening, walking home through the Quartieri Spagnoli because she'd discovered she liked the tangle of it, the washing strung between buildings like flags, the saints' shrines on every corner with their plastic flowers and photographs, she turned a corner and almost stepped on a child. He was lying on the wet stone of the alley, half in shadow. For a terrible frozen second, she thought he was dead. Then he moved. A small, convulsive motion, his hand curling, and she was already dropping to her knees beside him, her medical bag swinging off her shoulder. "Aspetta," she said. "Wait. Sto qui. Sono un medico. I'm here. I'm a doctor." He was perhaps 8 or 9, dark-haired, pale under the brown of his complexion, wearing clothes that were expensive. She noticed that even now, the quality of the fabric. And there was blood, a lot of it, from a gash on his forearm that had soaked through his sleeve. He looked at her with very dark eyes that were shocked past the point of crying. "Come ti chiami?" she asked, pulling open her bag. "What's your name?" "Marco," he whispered. "Marco, bene, io mi chiamo Gianna." "Good, I'm Gianna." "Dove ti sei fatto male?" "Where did you get hurt?" He looked at his arm. "Sono caduto," he said. "I fell." But the way his eyes moved, quick and sideways, told her it was more complicated than a fall. There was gravel embedded in both palms, which was consistent with a fall, and his right knee was scraped through his trousers, but the wound on his arm was deep and long. The edge of something, a piece of broken glass maybe, or a rusted metal corner. And it needed stitches. It needed more than field dressing. But field dressing was what she had, and she was good at it. She talked to him while she worked, keeping her voice low and steady, the way you talk to someone in the back of an ambulance, making the voice itself into a kind of medicine. She cleaned the wound with antiseptic from her bag and applied pressure and bound it tight. He flinched, but didn't cry. She noticed that, the way he held very still, the way he had already learned, at 8 or 9 years old, not to cry in front of people he didn't know. "This needs stitches," she told him. "You need to go to the hospital. Is there someone I can call? Your parents?" His expression changed. Something shuttered behind his eyes. "My uncle," he said. "Only my uncle." "What's his number?" He recited it without hesitation. She called it on her phone, expecting to leave a message. Instead, it picked up on the second ring. "Chi parla?" The voice was low, not aggressive, but with a quality of compressed authority that she felt rather than heard, like standing near something very large and very still. "My name is Dr. Ferretti," she said, in Italian, switching without thinking. "I'm with a child named Marco. He says you're his uncle. He's injured. I've stabilized him, but he needs a hospital." A pause, very brief. Then, "Where?" She gave him the street. He said nothing else and hung up. She looked at the phone for a moment, then put it away and turned back to Marco. "He's coming," she said. Marco's shoulders dropped slightly, the way a child's shoulders drop when someone they trust is coming. They waited in the alley together, the woman and the boy, while the sounds of Naples moved around them. A woman calling from an upper window, the distant complaint of a vesper, music from somewhere, always music. And Gianna held Marco's bound arm steady and asked him about school and football and whether he had a dog, and he answered in a boy's monosyllables, but he didn't look away from her face. She heard the car before she saw it. A sound like nothing else on this street, too quiet, too controlled, a large engine moving with deliberate restraint. The headlights came around the corner and stopped. The door opened. The man who stepped out of the black car was tall. That was the first thing she registered, the height, and then the way he moved, which was the way certain people move when they have never in their adult lives had to make room for anyone else in any space they entered. He crossed the alley in a few strides and crouched beside Marco, and for a moment she saw something cross his face, something urgent and unguarded, before it was replaced by a controlled steadiness. Marco. His voice, in person, was even lower. He put his hand on the boy's face, and the boy leaned into it. "I'm okay," Marco said. "She helped me." The man looked up at Gianna, who was perhaps 35, dark-haired, with the kind of face that was not classically handsome but was impossible to look away from. Strong-featured, olive-skinned, with eyes that were very dark and very still, the kind of stillness that might have been calm or might have been something else entirely. He was wearing a white shirt, open at the collar, and dark trousers, and he wore it the way men wear clothes when clothes are not something they think about because other things take precedence. He looked at her for a moment that felt longer than it was. "Dr. Ferretti," he said. "Your nephew needs stitches," she said. "Arm laceration, moderately deep. I've cleaned and bound it, but it needs to be properly sutured." He nodded once. "I'll take him." "I'll come," she said. Not an offer, a statement. Because she was the one who'd assessed the wound, and she wanted to make sure the hospital understood the mechanism of injury and the amount of blood loss. He looked at her again, as though he was deciding something. Then he said, "All right." She did not ask his name. She would learn it later, in the hospital, When the admissions nurse said it, and the other nurses went very still, and the man at the front desk looked at him with an expression that was not fear exactly, but was adjacent to it. Esposito. Vincenzo Esposito. She filed the name away without knowing yet what it meant. The emergency room at Ospedale del Mare received Marco Esposito with the particular heightened efficiency of a hospital department that has learned over time to recognize when certain families arrive. Gianna did not notice this at first. She was focused on Marco, on the transfer of care, on making sure the admitting physician understood the wound depth and the timeline, on staying long enough to see the sutures placed cleanly. She noticed it later, in retrospect. The way the corridor had cleared, the way the triage nurse had moved them immediately to a private room, the way Dr. Russo himself had appeared at 9:30 on a Friday evening without being called. But in the moment, she was only a doctor doing what doctors do, and Vincenzo Esposito stood in the corner of the room with his arms crossed and watched her with those very still, dark eyes while the pediatric surgeon worked, and Marco was brave in the particular way of children who have been taught that bravery is not optional. "You're not from Naples," Vincenzo said. "Not a question." "I'm from New York," she said. "Originally from here." "What brought you back?" She glanced at him. He was looking at Marco, not at her, but she had the distinct impression he was aware of her, with a precision that had nothing to do with where his eyes were pointed. "Family business," she said. He made a small sound that might have been acknowledgement. When it was finished, 9 stitches, neat and close, and Marco was sitting up with a bandaged arm and the slightly dazed expression of a child who has exceeded his own pain threshold and come out the other side, Vincenzo crouched in front of him again. At that height, crouching, he was still imposing, which was a quality Gianna found both annoying and interesting. "Cosa è successo davvero?" What really happened? Marco's eyes moved. "I fell." "Marco." The boy's chin went up. "Some older boys, in the piazza. I was cutting through and they didn't like it." The temperature in the room changed. Not visibly. Vincenzo's expression didn't shift by much, but the quality of the stillness around him changed. The way the air changes before a storm, pressure dropping. "Which boys?" he asked, very quietly. "Zio," their names. "Vincenzo." Gianna said it before she'd decided to. Both of them looked at her. "He's had a difficult enough evening. Let him rest." Another long pause. Then Vincenzo straightened and said to Marco, "We'll talk tomorrow." Marco, who had apparently been holding his breath, exhaled. Gianna gathered her jacket and her bag. Marco tugged her sleeve. "Grazie," he said. "Thank you." And then, with a gravity only children can produce, "You were very calm. I liked that." "You were very calm yourself," she said. "I liked that too." She turned to leave. Behind her, Vincenzo said, "Dr. Ferretti." She looked back. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. "Thank you," he said, "for what you did in the alley." "I'm a doctor," she said. "That's what I do." Not everyone stops. She held his gaze for a moment. "I always stop," she said, and walked out. She thought about him twice on the walk home. Once when she passed a street shrine with a candle burning inside a red glass, the flame very still in the windless air. Once when she unlocked her apartment door and the smell of her neighbour's cooking drifted up the stairwell, garlic and something rich. She thought about the way he'd crouched in front of the boy, and the way the air had changed when he learned what had really happened. There had been something very precise about the anger, not explosive, the opposite of explosive, concentrated. She poured a glass of water and stood at her window and told herself she was not thinking about him. She almost believed it. His name registered with weight 2 days later. Sunday, in the market near the seafront, she overheard two men talking in the rapid-fire dialect of Naples, the kind of dialect that stripped vowels to bones and swallowed whole syllables, and even with her fluent Italian, she caught only fragments. But she caught the name, Esposito. And she caught the other man's tone, careful, slightly lowered, the tone you use when you're discussing something large and slightly dangerous. She bought tomatoes and asked the vendor, a cheerful, grey-haired woman with strong forearms, if she knew the name. The woman's expression was brief and complicated. "The Espositos," she said. "You don't know them." "I've been away," Gianna said. "New York, a long time." The woman looked at her. "You should stay away from that name," she said, and changed the subject to the price of mozzarella with the finality of someone closing a door. Gianna went home and opened her laptop. It took her 40 minutes. She was good at research. Emergency medicine required a systematic approach to information, the ability to sort the relevant from the irrelevant quickly, and she found what she needed in a combination of newspaper archives, a court reporter's blog that seemed to know a great deal and was very careful about how it said it, and 2 academic papers on organized crime in the Campania region. The Camorra. Naples' own particular version of organized crime, older than the Mafia in some iterations, more fragmented, deeply embedded in the social and economic tissue of the city. Multiple clans, shifting alliances, a history written in headlines that always arrived after the fact. The Esposito clan, one of the most powerful in the city. And Vincenzo Esposito, she found his name in a 2019 court document, charges ultimately dropped, was its current head. She read everything twice, and then sat back and looked at the ceiling. She thought about Marco, with his careful stillness and his expensive clothes, and his sideways look when she asked what really happened. She thought about the way Vincenzo had stood in the corner of the hospital room, and the way the nurses had moved. She thought, I should stay away from this. She also thought, he thanked me, with complete sincerity. And then he said, not everyone stops. The phone rang. Unknown number, Italian prefix. She almost didn't answer. Then she did. Dr. Ferretti. The low, controlled voice. This is Vincenzo Esposito. I wanted to know if Marco could thank you in person. He asks about you. She was quiet for a moment. How is he? 9 stitches and insufferable pride about it. She found, against her will, that she almost smiled. He was very brave. He's been talking about you for 2 days. A pause. Would you have dinner? With us, nothing formal. Marco won't settle otherwise. She looked at what she'd read on her laptop, the court documents, the newspaper pieces, the careful language of people who knew how to say a great deal without saying anything directly. Mr. Esposito, she said. Vincenzo. I know who you are, she said. I looked you up. A brief silence. And? And I'm still deciding, she said, which was honest, which surprised her by being honest. Take your time, he said, as though he had all of it. She said she'd think about it. She hung up. She sat with the phone in her hand for a long while, and outside the window Naples moved around her, indifferent and radiant, and she thought, what kind of woman is afraid of a dinner invitation? She called back 20 minutes later and said yes. The address he sent her was in Posillipo, which she'd read enough about Naples to know was where old money and new power both went to look at the sea. The taxi drove her up through streets that narrowed and then opened onto a neighbourhood that felt different from the rest of the city. Quieter, more deliberate, the silence of places that can afford their own security. The house was not what she expected. She had expected something ostentatious, the instinctive aesthetic of power, marble and gates and the architecture of intimidation. What she found instead was a villa that was old and beautiful in the way of things that have been loved for a long time, creamy stone and cypress trees, and a garden that was overgrown in a way that looked intentional, the kind of place a painter might dream about. A man opened the gate before she knocked, young, compact, with the watchful quality of someone paid to notice things. He said nothing, only inclined his head and showed her through. The interior was like the exterior, old money, or money that had made itself old, beautiful furniture and paintings and books that were actually read, their spines cracked and worn. She had half expected to feel the weight of something corrupt, something that announced itself in the decor. What she felt instead was the particular warmth of a house where someone actually lived. Marco appeared from a corridor at a near run, saw her, and slowed to a walk with the elaborate casualness of a child performing nonchalance. "Gianna," he said. "Marco." She looked at his arm. "How is it?" "It hurts a lot," he said with satisfaction. "9 stitches," she said. "It's allowed to hurt." "Come see the terrace," he said. "You can see the whole bay." He took her hand with the easy confidence of a child who has learned to claim what he wants, and she let him lead her through the house and out through tall glass doors onto a terrace that stopped her breath. The Bay of Naples opened below them like a revelation. The city curved around the water in a great arc of light, and beyond it, the dark shape of Vesuvius sat against the sky, and the sea was that particular nighttime colour that existed somewhere between black and violet, and the air smelled of salt and jasmine and warmth. She stood at the stone railing and felt something shift in her. A surrender to the beauty of it, involuntary, almost against her will. "Beautiful," she said, without thinking. She wasn't sure if she meant the view or something else entirely. "You've been standing there for 30 seconds without moving," said Vincenzo's voice behind her. "My nephew is insulted you haven't noticed the table." She turned. He was at the terrace doorway, dressed simply, dark trousers, a charcoal shirt, sleeves rolled to the forearm, and she registered again that particular quality of stillness he had, the way he occupied space without appearing to need anything from it. "The view surprised me," she said. "It surprises me every time," he said. And there was something genuine in it, in the way he looked briefly past her at the bay, something that had nothing to do with performance. The table was set for 3, which she appreciated, because it was a dinner, not a negotiation. Marco positioned himself next to her and talked at length about football and a documentary about volcanoes he'd watched twice, and a friend at school who could burp the national anthem. And Gianna talked back with the ease of someone who had always found children more straightforward than adults. And Vincenzo watched them both with an expression she couldn't quite read, not guarded for once, just watching. The food was extraordinary. She told him so. "My housekeeper," he said. "I can't cook." "He tried once," Marco offered. "We had pasta for 3 days from the restaurant because the kitchen needed to be repainted." "That's not what happened." "Nonno said you set fire to an onion." An onion does not catch fire. Ours did, she laughed. It came out genuine, and it surprised all three of them slightly, herself most of all. Vincenzo looked at her when she laughed, looked at her the way you look at a painting you've walked past every day and suddenly seen for the first time. She felt it, without looking directly at him. After dinner, Marco was persuaded by an invisible logic of bedtime and his own eyelids drooping, and disappeared with the housekeeper, and Gianna and Vincenzo were left alone at the terrace table, with the remains of wine and the bay spread below them like an offering. "Ask me," he said. She looked at him. "You want to ask," he said, "about what you read. Do I seem like someone who asks questions they already know the answers to?" "No," he said. "You seem like someone who waits until she's sure the question is worth asking." She turned her wine glass once. "Are you what the newspapers say you are?" "Which newspaper?" "All of them." He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of evasion, the silence of someone deciding how honest to be. "I am Vincenzo Esposito," he said finally. "In Naples that means something specific. I don't apologize for it, and I don't explain it to strangers." "I'm not asking for an apology," she said, "or an explanation." "Then what are you asking?" She looked at the bay. "I'm asking if Marco is safe. With you." The silence that followed was different, heavier. "Marco is the only person in the world for whom I would burn it all down," he said. It was the most direct thing he'd said all evening, and it landed like something dropped from a height, final and true. "He doesn't have parents," she said, not a question. "His mother, my sister, died 4 years ago." A pause. "I'm what he has." She thought of Marco's carefully maintained bravery, the way he'd learned not to cry in front of strangers. She thought of the man in front of her, and the way he'd crouched at the boy's level and put his hand on his face. "He's lucky," she said, "to have someone who would." Something moved in Vincenzo's expression, brief, unguarded, gone. "No one has ever said that to me, about this particular quality." "What do they usually say?" "Something involving God and judgment," he said. She looked at him. He looked back. The bay turned quietly below them, and the candle on the table moved in a breath of warm air, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable, which she noted and filed away. "I should go," she said, not because she wanted to, because she'd learned to distrust comfort that arrived too quickly. He stood when she stood, which was old-fashioned, and she found, against her better judgment, that she didn't mind it. He walked her to the door himself and called the car, and they stood on the step while they waited, and the night air moved around them. "Will you come back?" he asked. The directness of it caught her off guard. No performance in it, just the question. "Why?" she said. "Because Marco will ask," he said, and then, after a beat, "and because I'll wonder if you did." The car arrived. She got in without answering. She thought about his face all the way down the hill. She went back on Thursday. She told herself it was because of Marco. She told herself this with some conviction for the first 24 hours, slightly less conviction for the following 48, and by Thursday morning she had stopped telling herself anything at all and simply dressed and went. Marco was home from school. He had an appointment with the paediatric surgeon to check the stitches, and he greeted her with the same elaborate casualness and immediately demanded she teach him to play card games, which she did, badly at a table in the garden while the September sun moved overhead and the sound of the city drifted up from below like something heard through water. Vincenzo appeared after an hour, came through the garden gate with a phone pressed to his ear, still in a conversation that he ended with 3 words and put the phone away. He looked at the card game. He looked at Gianna. "You're losing," he said. "I'm letting him win," she said. "No, you're not," Marco said. "I absolutely am. You played the wrong suit 3 times. Vincenzo sat on the garden wall with his arms crossed and said nothing, but something about his expression was different from the first night. The controlled watchfulness was still there. She suspected it was always there. But there was something else behind it. A quality of ease, the way a person looks when they've been tight for a long time and something has loosened incrementally. She caught him watching her twice. Both times he held her gaze without apology, which was either arrogance or honesty, and she couldn't quite decide which. They ate lunch in the garden, the 3 of them again, and Marco told her about his school and his friends and his grandfather Esposito, who had died 3 years ago, and whose photograph was in the front room, and whom Marco described with the particular reverence children have for dead grandparents. Vincenzo listened to this with a more complex expression. "Did you know him?" Gianna asked Vincenzo, aware it was a strange question about a man's own father. "Well," he said, which was all he said. She learned more about the city than about him that afternoon. He talked about Naples the way a man talks about something he's responsible for, not with romance, but with a precise awareness of its particulars, its problems, its beauty, its violence. He knew which neighbourhoods had flooding problems, and which piazzas had underground Greek ruins beneath them, and which churches were always unlocked, and which markets were worth getting up early for. "You love it," she said. "It's mine," he said, which was not the same as love, but was perhaps something more practical than love, more durable. She told him she was looking for someone. She wasn't sure why she told him. It came out in the easy back and forth of people getting acquainted, the currency of personal information exchanged without calculation. "A woman named Elena Mancini," she said. "She would be in her late 60s. I think she might still be in Naples." Vincenzo looked at her. "Why are you looking for her?" "She was my mother's sister. My mother died in the spring. I never knew my aunt existed until I found a photograph." A pause. "And your mother didn't tell you why she didn't speak of her?" "My mother didn't speak of Naples at all," Gianna said. "We left when I was 7. She never explained, and I never pushed, until it was too late to push." The afternoon light shifted across the garden. Somewhere a bird decided something, and then decided something else. "I can ask around," Vincenzo said. "Mancini isn't an uncommon name. But people who've lived here their whole lives, someone will know." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She looked at him. He was watching her steadily. "Why?" she asked. "Because it matters to you," he said, simply, without theatre. She looked away first, at the garden, at the bay glittering below the cypress trees. She thought, "Be careful." She thought it specifically and deliberately. She thought, "You know what he is." And she also thought, "He's not what I expected." That evening, driving back through the city, she took a wrong turn, genuinely, no other interpretation, and found herself in a neighbourhood she didn't recognize, narrower streets, older buildings, the particular quality of the quartieri in the early evening, when the light went golden, and people brought chairs outside, and the street became a living room. She stopped the car and got out, because she'd learned enough about Naples to know that some things had to be experienced on foot. She walked for 40 minutes. She found a church with a crypt that was open and went down into it and stood among the bones of Naples, the Fontanelle Cemetery, with its skulls arranged on shelves, each one adopted once by a family who'd claimed them as their own dead and prayed for their souls in exchange for intercession. The practice was older than the city's modern identity, this arrangement between the living and the dead. She stood in the candlelight and thought about her mother. Rosa Ferretti had left Naples in 1987 with 7-year-old Gianna and a single suitcase and never looked back. She'd rebuilt entirely in New York, language, career, identity, and had done it with such completeness that the seam of the old life barely showed. She'd been a good mother. She'd been loving and present, and she'd given Gianna everything she had the capacity to give. But there were locked rooms in her, and one of them was Naples, and Gianna had learned without being told that you didn't knock on that door. She'd respected it because she'd loved her. She'd resented it later, privately, because she was her mother's daughter, and she needed to understand things. Now her mother was dead, and the locked room was ajar, and she was standing among Naples' unidentified dead, thinking about a man with very still eyes who had offered to help her find someone she didn't know she'd been looking for her whole life. She went home and lay awake for a long time listening to the city, and thinking that Naples was doing something to her that she hadn't prepared for. October arrived in Naples with a drop in temperature that the city treated as a personal affront. The tourists thinned, the streets became more purely themselves. Gianna's shifts at the hospital were long and absorbing in the way that suited her. She had always needed, the immediacy of other people's crises as a counterweight to her own interior life. She and Vincenzo had developed something that she struggled to name. It wasn't a romance, not yet, not by anything she would admit to herself. But it was a habit. She found herself at the villa in Posillipo on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, which had become fact without either of them establishing it. She and Marco had finished the card game tournament and begun a chess project. Vincenzo watched and occasionally offered commentary that she was fairly certain was intentionally wrong to see if she'd correct him. She always did. "You're testing me," she said one evening, moving her bishop. "I'm trying to understand how you think," he said. "They're the same thing." He considered this. "Perhaps. What have you found?" "That you don't bluff," he said, "and that you would rather be precisely right than approximately liked." She looked up from the board. "Is that criticism?" "No," he said. "It's rare." The thing she could not have articulated to anyone who asked was that he was surprisingly easy to be with. She'd expected guardedness, performance, the careful presentation of a man who had learned that information was power and therefore shared none. What she got instead was not openness exactly. He was not open. He was a closed system in the sense of being self-contained and private, but a quality of directness that she found more restful than any performance of warmth would have been. He said what he meant. He didn't fill silences. He listened in a way that felt complete, as though what she said actually landed somewhere, actually registered. He told her things, in pieces, over those evenings. Not confessions, more like the way you drop context into a conversation when it's needed, the way you offer a map when someone's in unfamiliar territory. He told her about his father, who had built the Esposito name into what it was over 40 years, and who had been, by any external measure, a brutal and effective man, and who had also been the only person who understood Vincenzo in the particular way of fathers and eldest sons who are more alike than either of them are comfortable admitting. He told her about his sister Carmela, Marco's mother, who had been lighter than him in every sense, easier, warmer, with a laugh that could embarrass him in restaurants, and who had died of cancer at 32, and whom he missed with a precision that was indistinguishable from anger. She told him things too, about medical school and the particular loneliness of residency, which was the loneliness of total immersion, of becoming so entirely one thing that everything else fell away. About her father, who had remarried when she was 14 and moved to Chicago, and whom she loved at a distance, without difficulty and without great depth. About her mother, carefully, in pieces, the shape of the loss without all of its content. She did not tell him the whole story about Naples, not yet. She was not sure why not, perhaps because she didn't know the whole story herself. Vincenzo found Elena Mancini on a Wednesday. He called her at the hospital, which he'd never done before, and she stepped out of a consultation and stood in the corridor with her phone and heard him say, "I found your aunt." Her heart did something violent. "Where?" "Pozzuoli, 15 minutes outside the city. She runs a flower shop." Gianna sat down on the plastic corridor chair and put her hand on her knee to stop it moving. Does she know who I am?" "I sent someone to ask, discreetly. She knows about you. She knows your name." A pause. She cried. Gianna closed her eyes. "Okay," she said. "I can drive you," he said. "You don't have to." "I know." She was quiet. "Yes," she said. "All right. Yes." He was waiting outside the hospital at the end of her shift. He had his car and a driver, which he had gotten used to by now, the black cars, the men at doors, the peripheral security that she pretended not to notice, because noticing it led to conversations she wasn't ready for. She got in, and they drove out through the western side of the city toward Pozzuoli, and the Bay of Naples appeared alongside the road, wide and silver in the October afternoon, and neither of them felt the need to fill the drive with words. "What if she doesn't want to tell me why my mother left?" Gianna said at some point. "Then she doesn't tell you today," he said, "and you come back." "What if what she tells me is worse than not knowing?" He looked at her, directly. "Then you'll have known," he said, "and you can decide what to do with it." The flower shop was narrow and fragrant and full of the particular autumn flowers of the Campania coast, chrysanthemums and dahlias and late roses. A woman came out from behind the counter when the bell above the door rang, and she stopped when she saw Gianna, and for a moment neither of them moved. Elena Mancini was in her late 60s, grey-haired, with a face that was kind and weather-worn and unmistakably something Gianna recognised. The bone structure, the colour of the eyes, the particular set of the jaw. She was looking at Gianna the way you look at a ghost. "Rosa's daughter," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "Yes," said Gianna. Elena reached out and took her hand in both of hers. Her hands were florist's hands, calloused, gentle, permanently faintly dirty. She held Gianna's hands and looked at her face and said something very soft in Neapolitan dialect that Gianna didn't fully understand, but the emotion of it needed no translation. Vincenzo stayed in the car. He didn't ask to come in, didn't make it about his presence. He simply stayed outside while the two women went into the back room of the flower shop and drank coffee and began the long, careful conversation that is the only way back into a locked room. Gianna was in there for 2 hours. When she came out, her face was composed, but her eyes were doing something she didn't have complete control over. He got out of the car when he saw her. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, and she walked up to him and stopped, and they stood very close together in the October afternoon outside a flower shop in Pozzuoli. "She'll talk to me more," Gianna said. She wants to. There's a lot to tell. Good, he said. She looked up at him. Thank you. For what? For finding her, she said. For coming. For staying in the car. Something moved in his face. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was very still, very deliberate, and over almost before she'd registered it, and said, "Let's go home." She noticed he said home, and not back. She didn't correct him. She thought about the gesture for 3 days. It was such a small thing, a strand of hair, 2 seconds, his hand against the side of her face, barely the warmth of it. She had treated it, in the moment, with the particular composure she was capable of, looked at him, said nothing, got in the car. But in the days that followed, in the specific quiet of her apartment at 11 at night, with the city outside and no immediate crisis to absorb her, she thought about it with an attention she found both disproportionate and involuntary. She was not a woman who lost her head. She had been told this, by colleagues, by the men she'd dated, by her mother, who had said it with a complicated mixture of pride and regret. She was steady. She was rational. She was, in the assessment of one particularly frustrated ex-boyfriend, constitutionally incapable of being swept away. She was beginning to suspect that Naples was dismantling this reputation without her consent. She told herself, at various points over those 3 days, the following things. She had known him for less than a month. She knew what he was, what his world was. She had come to Naples to find her family's history, not to— she made herself supply the word, which was embarrassing— not to fall for a man who ran the city's most powerful criminal organization. She told herself all of this. It was sensible and true, and she believed every word of it. On Friday, she put on the blue dress she'd bought at the market in Chiaia, because she'd needed something that wasn't her work clothes, and she went to Posillipo. He opened the door himself, which he didn't always do. He looked at the dress for one moment that was shorter than it felt, and then he looked at her face and said nothing at all, which was more unsettling than anything he might have said. Marco was at his grandfather's, his maternal grandfather, Carmela's father-in-law, who lived in Fuorigrotta, and about whom Marco spoke with the exasperated fondness of someone who loves deeply and finds it embarrassing. The house was quiet. Gianna followed Vincenzo through to the terrace, where the table was set with candles, and the bay was doing that thing it did in the evening, when the lights came on around the arc of the water, and it became impossible to look away. "He's not here," Gianna said. "No," Vincenzo said. "He'll be back tomorrow." There was a pause in which they were both aware of what had been said. She picked up her wineglass and turned to the view. "Tell me about your father," she said. She heard him exhale. Then, "What do you want to know?" What kind of man he was, really? He was quiet for a moment. He was the kind of man who believed that order was worth any price, he said, that the absence of order was the worst thing. He grew up in a time when there was none, very poor. The state meant nothing to people like his family, nothing good anyway. So he made his own order. "And you inherited it?" "I inherited the position," he said. "Whether I inherited the belief is more complicated." She turned to look at him. He was leaning on the terrace railing, looking at the bay, and the candlelight was doing something unforgiving to his profile, all shadow and line. "Do you believe it?" she asked, "that order is worth any price?" "I believe," he said slowly, "that there are things in this city that would eat it alive if certain structures weren't in place. I believe I'm one of those structures. Whether that makes me a good man. He stopped. You're telling me you don't know, she said. I'm telling you I think about it, he said, which is possibly more useful than knowing. She was quiet. Then, Elena told me something about why my mother left. He looked at her. She left because of the Camorra, Gianna said. She said it carefully, watching his face. Her husband, my father's older brother, my uncle Giuseppe, who died before I was born, he refused to pay protection money to a clan in the neighbourhood. He was principled about it, or stubborn. She said she couldn't tell the difference. She paused. They shot him. In 1985, in the street. My mother was pregnant with me. The terrace was very quiet. That's why she left, Gianna said. That's why she never came back. That's why she never talked about it. Vincenzo had gone very still in a way that was different from his usual stillness. What clan? He said. His voice was controlled. I don't know, she said. Elena didn't say and I didn't ask. I wasn't ready to ask that yet. She watched him process this. Something was moving behind his eyes that she couldn't read, something that might have been calculation and might have been something more personal. Gianna, he said. I'm telling you, she said, because you asked about my family business when I first arrived, and because I think... She stopped, started again. I think you should know that my connection to this city isn't simple. No connection to Naples is simple, he said. Some are more complicated than others. They stood on the terrace for a long time after that, the two of them and the bay and the candles, and the conversation moved to other things, easier things, or at least different things. But the information sat between them, visible, claimed, neither of them pretending it wasn't there. At some point the candles burned low, and she realized it was past midnight and she should go. And he walked her to the door again, and at the door she turned and found him close. Not crowding her, nothing calculated about it, just the geography of the entryway and two people in it. And she was aware of his height and the warmth he carried and the specific quality of his attention, which she was beginning to understand was one of his most particular features, the way he paid attention, complete and unhurried, as though what she said and did and was constituted something he was committed to understanding. I'll see you Tuesday, she said. Yes, he said. She went down the step and out into the night, and behind her she heard him exhale, very quietly, as though he'd been holding something in. She held it too, all the way home. She was deep in a resuscitation. 46-year-old man, cardiac arrest. Third one this month from this neighbourhood, which told her something about diet and stress, and possibly something about what this neighbourhood contained. When her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she ignored it and focused on the patient, who came back to them at the 22-minute mark, with the peculiar reluctance of a man who had somewhere else he'd half decided to be. She checked her phone in the corridor afterward, hands still slightly shaky with the post-emergency biochemical cocktail that never quite resolved. A message from Vincenzo. Don't come Tuesday, there's something I need to deal with. She looked at it for a moment. She wrote back, Are you all right? His response was immediate. Yes. Marco is with you? She'd had Marco that afternoon, as it turned out. She'd started picking him up once a week after school, on the days the housekeeper couldn't, because Marco had asked, and she'd agreed, and there had been no further deliberation. She typed, He's here. He's fine. A pause, then, Good. She held the phone and thought about the word something. She thought about what something meant for a man in his position in this city. She had spent the past several weeks carefully, deliberately, not thinking too specifically about that. She'd found it was possible to be in his world without fully inhabiting it. You could be at his table, in his house, in the particular warmth of his attention, and still maintain the professional remove of someone who had not committed to anything. But his silence for 3 days told her something she found she didn't like, and finding she didn't like it told her something else. Marco was doing homework at her kitchen table. He was good at mathematics and contemptuous of history, which she found both understandable and alarming. "Where's your uncle?" she asked, which was not a question she'd have asked a week ago. Marco didn't look up. "Business," he said. "Does business often take him away suddenly?" "Sometimes." A pause. "He always comes back," Marco said, with the confidence of someone who has been told this enough times that they've decided to believe it. She made him dinner, and drove him home, and handed him to the housekeeper, and drove back through the city and sat at her window for a long time. He came back on Wednesday. She was at the hospital. She looked up from a chart, and he was there, in the corridor, which made no sense. Visiting hours were over. The emergency department didn't have visiting hours exactly, but there was a particular boundary line that people who weren't medical staff or patients didn't cross, and he'd crossed it, and none of the nurses had stopped him, which told her something about how he moved through rooms. He looked tired. It was the first time she'd seen anything on his face that could be described as tired, and it changed him, made him look less like the controlled power she'd become accustomed to, and more like a man who had been carrying something heavy for several days without putting it down. "I should have called," he said. "Yes," she said. "Are you busy?" She looked at her chart. She was always busy. She put the chart down. "Come on," she said. She took him to the family room at the end of the corridor, which was small and had a couch and a coffee machine that produced something technically describable as coffee. She made 2 cups and handed him one, and sat across from him and waited. "It's over," he said. "Whatever it was, it's done." "Are you hurt?" She asked it like a doctor first. He looked at her. "No." "Marco?" "He doesn't know anything happened." "Good." She looked at him steadily. "You don't have to tell me what it was." "I know." He was looking into the coffee cup. "There are things in my life, Gianna, that I won't ask you to understand or accept. But I didn't want to be absent, without explanation." She was quiet. The coffee machine dripped. In the corridor outside, someone's cart went by with the particular squeak she recognized as Nurse Palmieri's cart, which meant it was past 11. "I'm a doctor," she said. "My entire professional life is about the fact that people can be hurt and lost at any moment. I know that. I've known it for a long time." She paused. "I'm not afraid of that." He looked up at her. Really looked. "What I am," she said carefully, "is someone who needs to know what she's—" She stopped. Started again. "I need to know where the lines are." "The lines," he repeated. "The things I can't ask about. The things I shouldn't know. She looked at him. "The things that happen when you disappear for 3 days." "Things I'm responsible for," he said. "In a city that runs on complicated arrangements. Things that are ugly sometimes, and I won't pretend otherwise." "Do they involve—" "Not innocence," he said. It came out with a precision that told her it was something he'd thought about for a long time. "I draw lines of my own, Gianna. They're not the same as yours, but they exist." She looked at him for a long time. "I believe you," she said. which surprised both of them slightly. "You shouldn't necessarily," he said. "You barely know me." "I'm good at reading people," she said. "It's my job. Patients come in, they're frightened, they lie. About pain levels, about symptoms, about what they did and what they took. I've learned to read the difference." She paused. "You're not lying." He looked at her with something that was almost undone. "Go home," she said, standing. "Sleep. Come on Thursday, as usual." He stood. They were very close again in the small room, the same proximity as always, which they'd maintained with the careful formality of people who have not yet said certain things. "Gianna," he said. She looked up at him. His eyes were very dark and very close and tired, and she thought, "This is the most honest I have ever seen him, and it's the most beautiful, and I am in considerable trouble." "Thursday," she said, softly. "Thursday," he said. She walked him to the exit and watched him go. It started as a disagreement about nothing, which is how most significant things start. Thursday evening, Marco in bed by 9, and she and Vincenzo on the terrace with wine, and the very last of the warm weather, which they both knew without saying was ending, the season turning. He'd told her something about a meeting that had gone badly, not the content, just the shape of it, the particular frustration of dealing with men who were proud in the way that prevented them from being practical. And she had said something about pride being the most expensive thing a man could afford. "You think I'm proud," he said. "I think you're aware of your position every moment of the day," she said. "I think that's a kind of pride." "Position isn't pride. Position is responsibility." "When position and responsibility are the same thing, maybe," she said. "When a man can't admit error in front of others because it will read as weakness, that's pride." He looked at her. "When did I say I couldn't admit error?" "You told me the meeting went badly. You told me what the other men did wrong. You didn't tell me what you did wrong." A silence. He set down his wineglass. "You've been gathering evidence," he said, not entirely coldly. "I'm a diagnostician," she said. "It's reflexive. And your diagnosis is that I'm too proud." "My diagnosis," she said, "is that you're very good at controlling information, including information about yourself, and that this is adaptive for your life, but occasionally it makes you less than completely honest." He looked at her for a long moment. "Are you always like this?" "Like what?" "This precise," he said, "about people. Is it bothering you?" "It's—" He stopped. He picked up his wineglass again, put it down, ran his hand through his hair, which she had never seen him do before, and it undid something about the controlled presentation of him, made him look younger. "It's not bothering me," he said. "It's—" Another stop. "Uncomfortable?" she offered. "Clarifying," he said. She looked at him. "What does it clarify?" He looked back, and then he said, "The fact that I've been trying to find a reason to stand closer to you for 3 weeks and haven't found a suitable excuse." The terrace was very still. The bay moved somewhere below them, quietly. "That's honest," she said. "You wanted honesty," he said. She looked at him. He was watching her with the careful attention she'd come to know. Careful, but not cautious, which were different things. He was not cautious with her, she realized. He was the opposite of cautious. He was paying attention with everything he had, which for a man who controlled as much as he did was the most revealing thing she'd seen. "You could just stand closer," she said. He moved. Not much. A step, half a step, less. But the space between them became something different, became charged in the way of things before events. Gianna, he said. Her name, the way he said it in Italian, had been doing something to her for weeks. This time was no different. It was low and certain, not a question. Yes, she said, which answered the question he hadn't asked. He kissed her. It was the opposite of tentative. It was the kind of kiss that happens when two people have been waiting long enough that the waiting has built something with structural integrity, and when it finally releases, it takes everything with it. His hand came to the side of her face, the same gesture as outside the flower shop, but complete now. His palm against her jaw, his thumb at her cheekbone, and she put her hands against his chest and felt him breathe. It lasted a long time, or a short time. She genuinely could not tell. When they separated, the bay was still there and the candles were lower, and she was very aware of the warmth of him. "I've wanted to do that," he said, "since the alley." "Since the alley?" she repeated. "I was crouched over an injured child." "Yes," he said, completely unrepentant. She looked at him, at his face, which was different now. Not the controlled presentation, but something underneath it, the raw material of him, which was fiercer and warmer and less composed than she'd imagined. She kissed him this time. He made a sound very low against her mouth and pulled her closer with a careful possessiveness that was new and entirely coherent, as though he'd been practicing the specific geometry of this for longer than she knew. Later, much later, they sat on the terrace with the wine gone and the candles down to stubs and the bay very dark and beautiful below them, and she was leaning against his shoulder in a way that had happened naturally and without announcement. "This is going to be complicated," she said. "Everything worth having is," he said. "I mean specifically complicated. You know what I mean." "Yes." His hand moved in her hair. "I know." "I need to tell you something," she said. "Tell me." "I'm still finding out about my family, about why they left. There might be things I learn." She paused. "There might be things that make this harder." His hand stilled. "Are you telling me to wait?" "I'm telling you to know that something might change what we're—" She stopped. "I don't know what we are yet." "I know what we are," he said. She looked up at him. He was looking at the bay, and his profile was made of shadow and candlelight, and he said, "I've known since the alley." She was quiet. Then, "What are we?" He looked down at her. "Something I'd like to protect," he said, which was such a specific and guarded and honest thing that she couldn't argue with it, and didn't try. She stayed until 2 in the morning. She drove home through the empty city, with the windows down and the night air moving through the car like something that had permission, and she was not frightened, which was its own kind of answer. October deepened into November, and something settled between them that had the quality of things that have found their right position after a long time looking. She was at the villa more often than not. Marco, with the serene instinct of children who want what they want, announced that she should have a room, and Vincenzo, with the serene instinct of men who also want what they want, said nothing, but showed her the guest room with its view of the garden and its morning light. She didn't stay, not yet, but the room was there. The hospital was absorbing, which was one of the reasons she'd chosen emergency medicine. You couldn't take your own life home with you, because the present tense was always more urgent. She worked with Dr. Russo and a team she'd come to know well, and Naples gave her everything an emergency department could ask for, which is to say, it gave her a great deal that was difficult and rewarding, and occasionally heartbreaking. She was good at her work in a way that felt complete, that had nothing to do with ambition or performance. She was good at it because it was, in the most fundamental sense, what she was. She could feel a room change when she walked into it during a crisis. The anxiety level dropped. People moved differently. She'd been told this and hadn't believed it the first few times, and had eventually accepted it, the way you accept a diagnosis you didn't want but can't argue with. Vincenzo watched her work once, by accident. He'd come to collect her at the end of a shift and waited in the corridor, and there had been an elderly man who'd collapsed in the waiting room, and she hadn't hesitated, had been on her knees beside him before the duty nurse had registered what was happening. Afterward, when he drove her home, he was quiet for a while. "What?" she said. "You're very good," he said. "I've been doing it for 10 years. "It's not the years," he said. "It's the... You become something different when you're working, something complete." She looked at him. "Is that what you see?" "Yes." He kept his eyes on the road. "It's what I've seen from the beginning, even in the alley. You weren't frightened or uncertain. You were just entirely present." "I'm always frightened," she said. "I've just learned to work anyway." He glanced at her. "That's exactly it," he said. She had not met his lieutenants. She had not entered his world, the real world of it, the operational one, and they had not discussed whether she would. There was a tacit understanding that they were building something in the space that existed adjacent to his life, not inside it, and she was comfortable with this. She was not naive enough to think it would last indefinitely, but she was also not a woman who anticipated problems before they announced themselves. What announced itself instead was something she hadn't anticipated. She was at a dinner, a restaurant Vincenzo had brought her to, elegant and discreet, in Chiaia, and a man stopped at their table, 50-ish, well-dressed, with the kind of smile that was all surface and nothing underneath. "Vincenzo," he said, in a tone that carried history. Vincenzo looked up. Something shifted in his face, not dramatically, not with the obvious tells of a man caught off guard, but she saw it because she'd learned to look. "Aldo," he said. "And who is this?" The man's eyes moved to Gianna with an interest that was not flattering. "A friend," Vincenzo said, flat, final, in the tone of someone closing a conversation. Aldo smiled wider. "Of course." He looked at Gianna. "You're the American doctor. I've heard about you." She looked at him steadily. "I'm afraid I can't say the same." Something flashed in Aldo's eyes. The smile didn't change, but the quality of it did. He said something to Vincenzo in rapid Neapolitan that she only half caught, the consonants swallowed, something about an old understanding and something about attention. Vincenzo said, very quietly, one word she did catch: "Basta." Enough. Aldo left. The dinner continued. But the quality of the air at the table had changed. "Who was that?" she asked. "A man from the Gennaro family," Vincenzo said. He was cutting his food with unnecessary precision. "Old alliance, currently complicated." "He knew about me." "People talk." "He didn't like seeing me here." Vincenzo set down his fork. "The fact that you're with me," he said, "will be noted by people who think my attention to you means something they can use, or challenge, or worry about. That's unavoidable." He looked at her directly. "I told you it would be complicated." "I know." She picked up her wine. "I'm not scared of complicated." "I know you're not," he said. "That's..." He stopped. "That's what?" "That's one of the things about you," he said, in a tone that wasn't completing the sentence so much as rerouting it. And she let it go, because sometimes the honest thing was knowing which questions not to ask yet. She noticed on the drive home that there were 2 cars instead of 1. She noticed that Vincenzo's attention during the drive was divided in a way she recognized now. He was listening to her and also tracking the street, the mirror, the particular calculations of a man who has lived long enough in this city to make paranoia functional. "I'm going to be fine," she said. "I know," he said. "You're worried." "I'm careful," he said. "There's a difference." He glanced at her. "You'll tell me if anything happens, anything that feels wrong." "I will." "I mean it." "I know you mean it," she said. "I said I will." He reached across and took her hand, held it for the rest of the drive. She looked out the window at Naples passing by, the lit windows, the street shrines with their candles, the cat that watched them from a low wall with ancient eyes, and thought about how strange it was that this felt more like safety than anything she'd known in this city. She also thought about Aldo from the Gennaro family and the way he'd looked at her. She tucked that thought away, not gone, just filed. She stayed the night for the first time on a Saturday in mid-November. There was nothing dramatic about it. She'd had wine with dinner, and they'd talked late, and the air had turned cold in the way of November evenings by the sea, and he'd said there was no reason to drive home, and she'd said, all right. And it had been as simple and as complicated as that. The room with the morning light was everything the light suggested. It came in early, gold and clear, and she lay in it and listened to the house, which had sounds she was learning. The particular creak of the 3rd stair, the housekeeper's arrival at 7, Marco's alarm, which went off at 7:30 and was followed by a second alarm at 7:35, and usually a third human intervention by Vincenzo at 7:42. She heard him knock on Marco's door. She heard Marco's protest. She heard Vincenzo's single, unargued response, and then the sounds of a child getting up. She smiled at the ceiling. Breakfast was the 3 of them, which she had not experienced before, this ordinary domestic architecture, the coffee and the bread, and Marco's monologue about a history test he had not studied for and considered the teacher's fault for assigning, and Vincenzo's complete non-reaction to this argument, and her own position at this table, which was somewhere between guest and family, and was finding its own definition by existing. After Marco left for school, the house was quiet. Vincenzo poured more coffee and sat across from her and looked at her in the morning light. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, in a tone that meant everything. "Vincenzo." "You look—" He stopped. "I look?" "Right," he said. "Here, you look right." She looked at her coffee. It was such a simple word for what he'd said, and it was more intimate than anything more elaborate would have been. "I talked to Elena yesterday," she said. "She told me more." He waited. "She told me the name of the clan." She looked at him. "The one that killed my Uncle Giuseppe." His hands around the coffee cup were very still. "It was called the Fuorigrotta family," she said. "They're gone now. She said they were absorbed or destroyed in the 90s, but at the time they were—" She paused. "She said they were tied to the larger structure, the Camorra families in the area." "Yes," he said carefully. "She doesn't know who runs this city now," Gianna said. "She lives in Pozzuoli. She has a flower shop. She's not that kind of connected." A pause. "But I know who runs it now." Vincenzo put his cup down. "I know," she said, "and I'm telling you because I need you to know that I know. And I need you to know that that it's not." She stopped and put her hands flat on the table. "My uncle died before I was born. My mother spent her life running from the grief of it. I've spent my life coming back to it." She looked at him. "I'm not blaming you for something that happened 40 years ago. I'm not equating you with the men who did it." "But," he said. "But it's part of my history," she said. "And your world is the same world, and I needed to say it out loud." He was very quiet. She could see him thinking, the particular quality of his attention turned inward. "Tell me the man's name," he said, "the one who gave the order." "I don't know it. Elena didn't know it. Does it matter?" "It matters," he said, "to me." A pause. "It matters that a man in my world, this world, whatever it was then, took something from your family." "Vincenzo." "I can't undo it," he said. "I know that, but I want to know." She looked at him. She thought, this is a man who has lived his whole life in a particular morality, one she doesn't share and isn't sure she can endorse, but who is not, has never been, in all the time she's known him, cynical about it. He cares. Under the layers of control and power and the particular armour of a man who was born into this life and built himself to survive it, there is something that cares. And caring in his world is the most dangerous thing. "I'll ask Elena," she said. "Thank you," he said. They sat in the morning quiet with their coffee, and eventually the housekeeper arrived and began the sounds of the house reforming itself around the day, and Vincenzo went to his study, and she sat at the kitchen table with her own thoughts, and felt the shape of what they were building together, which was strange and imperfect and real. She met 3 of his men that week, not by design, they simply existed in the periphery of the villa. Men who came and went at particular hours, who were always at the gate, who appeared in the study doorway while she was in the garden with Marco, and said quiet things and waited for Vincenzo's response. She treated them the way she treated the nurses at the hospital, with direct professional courtesy, no performance of fear, no performance of warmth either, just clarity. They looked at her with the specific assessment of people whose job was to notice things. One of them, a quiet man named Enzo, who was perhaps 40, and had hands that had been broken at some point and healed, paused by the garden wall while Marco was showing her something in the jasmine. "He's different," Enzo said, very quietly, meaning Vincenzo. She looked at him. "Different how?" Enzo considered. "Lighter," he said, as though the word was not one he used often. She thought about that for a long time. She did not want to go to the party. She said this clearly, and he listened with the particular quality of listening that meant he was going to address the objection with information rather than pressure. "It's a charity event," he said, "for the hospital's paediatric ward. It's expected that I attend, and I would like you to be with me." "You would like," she said. "Yes." She looked at him. "When you say you'd like, I mean I would also like anyone who is paying attention to understand clearly that you are not unprotected," he said. It was said evenly, without drama. After the dinner with Aldo Gennaro. She absorbed this. "You're worried about me." "I'm being careful," he said. Again. "What's the difference?" "The difference," he said, "is that worry is passive, careful is active." She wore black, not because the colour meant anything to her, but because she owned it, and it required no explanation. He came to her apartment to collect her, and stood in her doorway, and looked at her, and said nothing for a moment, that told her everything she needed to know about how she looked in the black dress. The venue was a converted palazzo in the heart of the city, the kind of building that had been everything and was now elegant by virtue of its survival, its walls 12 feet thick, and its ceilings frescoed, and its courtyard lit for the night with warm amber lights that made every face look like something worth painting. She was aware, from the moment they arrived, of the invisible hierarchy of the room. She had been to parties in New York where power arranged itself, hospital fundraisers, medical conference dinners, and she recognized the specific gravitational system, the way people orbited certain figures, the way conversations included some people and excluded others, by adjustments so small they were impossible to point at. Vincenzo moved through it, the way he moved through every room, unhurried, with a quality of occupying the centre that did not require him to position himself there. People came to him. They didn't flock, nothing that obvious, but they arrived at his shoulder at particular moments, said particular things, and departed. She was introduced. Every introduction was watched. She understood that she was being observed and assessed and filed away by people whose business it was to notice things. And she looked at them clearly, and shook their hands, and talked when talked to, and didn't perform anything. Aldo Gennaro was across the room. She saw him before he saw her. When he did, his gaze went from her to Vincenzo and back, and something moved in his expression that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but was adjacent to both. "He doesn't like me being here," she said quietly. Vincenzo's hand found the small of her back, not claiming her, something subtler and more serious, placing himself in the architecture of the room in a way that said something without words. "He'll manage," he said. A woman approached, 50s, elegant, with the look of someone who had spent decades being the most composed person in any room and had gotten very good at it. She kissed Vincenzo on both cheeks with warmth that seemed genuine. "Caterina Ferrara," Vincenzo said. "She runs the charity." Caterina turned to Gianna. "The American doctor," she said, with an interest that was warm rather than predatory. "You're at Ospedale del Mare. I've heard good things from Dr. Russo." "He's kind," Gianna said. "He's accurate," Caterina said. "We're grateful for your work. The pediatric ward is dear to me." She glanced at Vincenzo. "He gives very generously to it, every year." She said it without particular implication, just fact. But Gianna noticed it. She was learning to notice the ways in which his world was not entirely what the newspapers said it was, the ways in which the money moved not only in the directions fear required, but sometimes in other directions, quieter ones. Later, on the terrace of the palazzo, there was always a terrace, Naples insisted on it, she and Vincenzo stood apart from the noise of the party, and the night was cool, and the city spread below them. "Tell me something," she said. "What?" "Tell me something you've never told anyone." He looked at her sideways. "That's a large ask." "You can refuse." He was quiet. She watched his profile. The party noise was distant and warm. "I was 22, he said finally, when my father told me I would take over. I was in my 3rd year of an economics degree. I'd been thinking about finishing it, moving to Milan, doing something," he paused, "ordinary." "What happened?" "I came home for a weekend. My father told me someone had made a move against the family. Nothing dramatic, a business dispute, but the kind that had to be answered. And I watched him answer it." A pause. "And I understood watching him that it was mine. Not the methods, the responsibility, the city. He looked at the lights below. I left the university the following week. "Do you regret it?" she asked. He thought for a long time. "I regret some of the things it required," he said. "I don't regret who it made me." She looked at him. The honesty of it, the precision of the distinction, was characteristic of him, and characteristic of why she was standing on this terrace rather than anywhere else in the world. "I have a regret," she said. "Tell me." "I wish I'd come back sooner," she said, "before my mother died. I wish I'd made her tell me. I think she needed to." He turned and looked at her fully. "She did what she thought would protect you," he said. "I know." She looked at the city. "That's the worst part. She was right, and she was also wrong, and I can't tell her either." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into it, and they stood like that for a long time, while Naples moved below them, beautiful and complicated, and entirely itself. December came in cold, and the city put on its Christmas decorations with the theatrical exuberance it brought to everything. Lights and creches in every piazza, the famous Neapolitan presepe figurines in the shops of San Gregorio Armeno, a nativity scene in the hospital lobby that featured, alongside the traditional characters, a figure in a white coat which she suspected was intended to represent the entire medical staff. She and Vincenzo had fallen into something that had the quality of a life being built together, which was faster than she'd intended, and exactly the right pace for what it was. She knew the sounds of his house now, the way she knew the sounds of her own apartment. She knew which silences meant he was working through a problem, and which meant he was genuinely at rest. She knew that he drank his coffee without sugar, but would not admit to wanting the pastry that he always took when she bought them. She knew that he read in the evenings, history mainly, and economics, and occasionally a novel in English, which he read slowly and with a dictionary, and that he would look up from the book sometimes just to find her in the room, and when he found her, the looking up would end and he'd go back to the page. She knew she was in love with him. She hadn't said it. She thought he knew. She thought the knowing was mutual, and that they were both, with the particular caution of adults who have been shaped by their losses, taking their time with the words. She found out what had happened in 1985 in the middle of December, at Elena's flower shop, on a Thursday afternoon when the heaters were on and the chrysanthemums smelled of something cold and sweet. Elena had been working up to this. Gianna had felt it coming for weeks. The way the older woman would begin a sentence and reroute it, the way certain questions produced a careful pause before the answer. She'd waited. She was good at waiting. She was also by now frightened of what she would learn, which told her she was ready. "The man who ordered it," Elena said, turning a stem in her hands, "was not from the Fuorigrotta family. He was from the family above them." Gianna looked at her. "The bigger family," Elena said. She looked up. Her eyes were very careful. "The family that oversaw everything in that part of the city." Gianna's hands were very still on the counter. "What family?" she asked. Elena set down the stem. She said the name. Gianna heard it the way you hear something in a dream, words that arrive with complete clarity and no context. She heard it twice, internally, as though needing to be sure. She felt the cold of the shop and the smell of the flowers and the hum of the heater, and outside the February rain beginning on the street. She said, "Are you certain?" "I've been certain for 40 years, Elena said. "I didn't say it because Rosa didn't want it said." She was afraid. She thought if anyone knew she knew. A pause. She was afraid for you specifically. Gianna drove back to Naples with both hands on the wheel and a perfect blank clarity in her mind. The same clarity she had in the middle of a trauma resuscitation. The kind that was not calm so much as the suspension of everything that isn't immediately relevant. She parked in front of her apartment and sat in the car for a long time. The family. The name Elena had said, Esposito. Not Vincenzo, he would have been a child in 1985. Not him directly, but the name, the family. The same name that now slept in her bed and cooked ruinous onions and crouched at Marco's level and knew the precise weight of her hair. She sat in the car. She thought, there might be 1,000 Esposito families in Naples. It's one of the most common surnames in the city. There is nothing conclusive about a name. She also thought, Elena has been carrying this for 40 years. She was certain. She said so. She thought, I have to tell him. She also thought, I have to know exactly what I'm telling him first. She went upstairs and opened her laptop and began searching with the same systematic approach she'd used on everything else. And this time she went further. Went into the newspaper archives of the late 80s, the court records that were publicly available, the academic histories of the Camora's structure in those years. It took her until midnight. What she found was not conclusive. What she found was the Esposito clan had controlled that area of the city in the mid-80s. That a Raffaele Esposito, Vincenzo's father, as she'd understood it, the man he'd described as building the name, had been the clan's head from 1980 to his death 3 years ago. That the Fuorigrotta family had been subordinate to the Espositos during that period. None of it said, Raffaele Esposito ordered the killing of Giuseppe Ferretti in 1985. None of it proved anything. But none of it disproved it either. She closed the laptop. The room was dark except for the city outside the window. She sat in the dark for a very long time. She thought about his face in the kitchen that morning. She thought about the way he'd said, I want to know the name. It matters to me. She thought, he doesn't know. He can't know. Because if he knew, he would have said so. He would have told her. He was not, whatever else he was, a man who lied to her face. She was sure of this the way she was sure of very few things, but she was not sure of what his father had done. She was not sure of what to do with what she didn't know. She lay down on her bed without undressing and stared at the ceiling and let Naples breathe around her in the dark, and she did not sleep. She avoided him for 4 days. It was poorly done, and she knew it. She was busy, genuinely. The hospital was always genuinely demanding, but the hospital had always been demanding, and it had not stopped her before. She returned his calls late, briefly, with the specific brevity of someone who is choosing their words with more care than usual. She cancelled Tuesday without a sufficient explanation. On the 4th day, he appeared at the hospital. He didn't come into the department. He waited in the lobby, which she knew he'd done because the duty nurse came to find her with the look of someone who has been asked to deliver a message by a person they are slightly afraid of. She went down. He was standing near the entrance in his coat, and he looked at her when she came through the door with an expression that was not angry and not hurt. That was worse. The specific, focused attention of a man who has decided to understand something. 4 days, he said. I know, she said. What happened? She looked at him. She could not have this conversation in the hospital lobby. She said, Come to my apartment tonight. Now, he said, not harshly, just certain. She looked at the clock on the wall behind his head. She had 20 minutes before her next patient. She looked back at him. 20 minutes, she said. Come up. In her office, small, functional, nothing personal except a photograph of her residency group on the wall, she made them both coffee from the machine she'd learned to tolerate and sat down at her desk and looked at him across it. I learnt something, she said, from Eleanor. He was completely still. The name of the family above the Fuorigrotta clan, she said, the family that ordered my uncle's killing. She watched his face. Eleanor said, Esposito, she said. The silence that followed was the longest she'd sat in with another person. She watched his face move through something she'd never seen on him before. Not quite shock, because he was too controlled for shock, but the specific expression of a man whose understanding of his own life has just encountered a wall. His eyes went somewhere internal. His hands on the armrests were very still. When, he said. His voice was careful. 1985. She watched him calculate. My father, he said, not a question. I don't know for certain, she said. I found nothing conclusive. Elena is certain, but Elena has been carrying this alone for decades, and certainty carried alone can... She stopped. My father, he said again. Vincenzo. It would have been my father, he said. In 1985, he was the head. If the Fuorigrotta family moved against someone, it was with his authority. He stopped. He looked at her. Giuseppe Ferretti. My uncle. He closed his eyes. It was very brief. When he opened them, they were older. I didn't know, he said. I know you didn't. Gianna, I know, she said, more quietly. He stood. He moved to the window. Her office faced the car park, not the sea, nothing beautiful, and stood with his back to her, one hand on the frame. My father, he said, was a man who did what he decided was necessary. I told you this. I told you I inherited the position and not necessarily the belief. A pause. I have spent 20 years trying not to undo it, you can't undo it, but to make of this city something different than what he made of it. She said nothing. She let him have the space. This changes nothing, he said, and then immediately, that's not true. It changes... He turned. What does it change for you? She looked at him. I don't know yet, she said honestly. Are you? He stopped. The control was very present, but underneath it something that was in actual pain. Are you going to leave? It was such a direct question, such a stripped thing under all of it. She said, No. He looked at her. I'm not leaving, she said, but I need time to understand what I feel about it. I'm not going to perform not being affected when I am. She held his gaze. And I need you to be honest with me about what your father was. My father, he said, with controlled precision, was a man who built power in a city that required his kind of power, and who did terrible things in that building, and who I loved, and whose lessons I partly rejected, and who is dead, and who I cannot ask, and who... He stopped. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Who I cannot make answer for this. I know, she said. I'm sorry, he said. The two words landed like stones. She understood what they cost, from him, from this man who'd been formed by a world that ran on never admitting anything. I know, she said again. He left before her next patient. She sat alone in her office for a few minutes, with her coffee going cold, and looked at the photograph of her residency group on the wall, all of them young, all of them at the beginning of something, and thought about the nature of inheritance, what we're given by those who came before us, and what we do with what we're given. and whether it's possible to come down on the right side of it. She thought, I don't know if there is a right side. She thought, I know what kind of man he is. Those were two different thoughts, and they were both true. The week that followed was the most honest week they'd had. Honesty, she was finding, had a different texture in real relationships than in the therapy-speak version of it that she'd been trained to offer patients. Real honesty was not clean. It was not cathartic. It was more like surgery, necessary and painful and slow, and the recovery was the longer part. She talked to Eleanor twice. Eleanor, who had kept this secret for her dead sister's sake for decades, was both relieved and frightened to have released it. Gianna asked questions she'd been afraid to ask. What had her mother known? Had Rosa known it was the Esposito family directly? Yes, Eleanor said. Rosa had known. She'd been told by someone she trusted not to tell. She was afraid, Eleanor said. She was pregnant. She had nothing. She took you and she ran. And she never looked back, because looking back meant knowing, and knowing meant fear. She was right to be afraid, Gianna said. She was right, Eleanor agreed. Then. That was then. Gianna went to Vincenzo that same evening. He opened the door and looked at her, and she could see that the 4 days of her distance had cost him something he hadn't put down yet. Can I come in? She said. This is still your house, he said. She came in. Marco was in his room, audibly enthusiastic about something on a screen. The kitchen smelled of something burning, which was unexpected. Are you cooking? She said. He looked at the stove with an expression of betrayal. I was attempting to. She went to the stove and moved the pan off the heat. The onion inside it had not caught fire, but was committed to the possibility. She turned down the flame and started over, finding the right pan and the olive oil and the rhythm of the thing, which she did automatically, the way you do things you learned before you had to think about them. He stood behind her and watched. My mother knew, she said, without turning. She knew it was your family. I know, he said. He'd found that out too, or determined it. She didn't know how, didn't ask the method. She was protecting me, Gianna said. She didn't tell me because she thought it would... She paused. I don't know. Keep me away? Keep me from coming back? Did you ever almost come back? Twice, she said. In medical school once, and after I finished residency. What stopped you? She thought about it. I don't know, she said. I think I was afraid of what it would feel like to want something I'd been told, implicitly, was dangerous. She put onions in the pan and listened to them hiss. Behind her, she heard him move, and then he was close, his hands on the counter on either side of her, not touching, but present, surrounding. I need to tell you something, he said. Tell me. There is no... I won't construct any justification for what my father did to your uncle. There is none. What he was, what the world was that made him possible, I have lived inside it my whole life, and I know the shape of it, and I know that it is not, that it takes things that are not owed it. A pause. Your uncle's life was not owed to it. She looked at the onions. I know, she said. I know, Vincenzo. And I need to tell you, he continued, that I am not my father, that the world I've made of this city is different, not innocent. Nothing is innocent, I know that. but different. His voice was very low. And I need you to believe that. Not for me, for yourself. Because if you don't believe it, you shouldn't be here. She turned. He stepped back enough for her to turn, but not enough to go far, and she looked up at his face, which was completely unguarded in the way it only was in the specific privacy of the two of them. "I believe it," she said. "Gianna, I believe you," she said. I have things to work through, about my family, about what happened, but not about you." She held his gaze. "Not about who you are." He looked at her for a long time. Then he put his forehead against hers, very gently, and she put her hands against his chest, and they stood in the kitchen with the onions going soft in the pan, and Marco's enthusiastic commentary audible from down the hall, and she thought, this is the most specific kind of love, the kind that sees the complication and stays. "I burned the first onion," he said against her forehead. "I noticed." Marco exaggerated about the kitchen. "Somewhat," she said, "only somewhat. You nearly set fire to a pan." "It was fine," he said. "It wasn't," she said, and somehow, they both laughed. Not the performance of laughter, not to break tension, but genuinely, and it ran through the kitchen like warmth, and Marco appeared in the doorway 5 seconds later with the reliable instinct of children who detect levity and want to participate. There was a doctor at the hospital whose name was Luca Romano, and who was 37 and handsome in the specific way of men who are aware of it without being insufferable about it, and who had been consistently kind to Gianna since her arrival in a way that she had registered as professional and nothing more. She had not considered that other people might register it differently. She was at the hospital Christmas party, a practical affair in the cafeteria, with wine that cost €8 a bottle, and a playlist that reflected the eclectic tastes of a 40-person department, when Luca Romano brought her a glass and said he'd been meaning to ask her something. "Of course," she said. "There's a medical conference in Rome in January," he said, "a trauma and emergency care symposium. I was wondering if you'd like to come. The department would cover it. You'd present very well, and your work here has been—" She began to understand this was a professional invitation. Then she saw his expression and understood it was also not entirely professional. "I'm very flattered," she said, with complete honesty and the specific warmth of someone delivering a clear no, while meaning it to land kindly. "But I'm with someone." Luca Romano took this with grace. They finished their conversation and parted, and she didn't think about it again. She told Vincenzo about it that night, not because she felt any obligation to confess, but because she'd found she liked telling him things that had happened in her day, the habit of sharing the texture of her hours. It was one of the ways she'd noticed she was in love with him. Not the large things, but the small things, the impulse to share. She told him casually, in the kitchen, over the remains of dinner. He was very quiet for a moment. "A colleague," she said. "Yes," he said. "He was perfectly decent about it when I said I was taken." Another pause. "You said taken." "I said I was with someone." He was quiet. She looked at him. His expression was controlled, but there was something underneath it, a quality she hadn't seen in him before, or had seen only in glimpses, that was not rational, and he knew it wasn't rational, and was working very hard to be rational about it. "Vincenzo," she said. "I'm fine," he said. "You look like you're doing math problems to calm yourself down." He looked at her. "He brought you wine." He was being collegial. He brought you wine, he said again, with a precision that told her this was not about Luca Romano at all, but about something else, something older and more personal. I'm here, she said.
With you. I told him I was with someone, because I am.
I know, he said. Then, I don't like it, he said flatly. And then, I'm aware that's not a rational position. It's really not, she agreed. I'm aware. He pushed back from the table, stood, walked to the terrace door, and looked at the city for a moment, his back to her, his hands in his pockets. She watched him. She thought, I love this man, and he is also ridiculous, and both things are true. Vincenzo, she said. He turned. Come here, she said. He came back to the table. She stood and took his face in her hands, which was something she did sometimes, just held his face, feeling his jaw, the warmth of his skin, and she looked at him directly. There is no Luca Romano, she said. There is no one else. There has been no one else since I stood in that alley in the Quartieri and called your number. She held his gaze. You understand? He looked at her with an expression that was too much of several things at once to be describable simply. You're not the easiest man to be in love with, she said. The word landed, and she watched it land. His hands came up and covered hers. What did you say? He said. You heard me. Say it again. She looked at him. I'm in love with you, she said more simply, which has complicated my life considerably, and is entirely your fault for being in that alley when I called. I was at dinner, he said. I drove at some speed. I know, she said. Gianna. Her name, in that voice, with that weight. I know, she said again, meaning the word back, meaning the thing he couldn't say yet, but was saying with his hands holding hers, and his eyes, and the particular totality of his attention. He kissed her. Not the same way as the first time. This was something different, something that had more history in it, more of the weeks they'd been building, and the things they'd told each other, and the specific gravity of two people who have decided. Stay, he said, against her hair. Marco has school tomorrow, she said. I'll drive him. You're terrible at mornings. I'll try harder, he said. She laughed and stayed. The problem arrived in January in the shape of Aldo Gennaro. She'd filed him away, the man at the restaurant with the surface smile and the assessing eyes, and she'd noted his presence at the charity event, and she'd heard Vincenzo's brief and controlled accounts of the situation. The Gennaro family and the Esposito family had a business arrangement that was under strain. Aldo Gennaro wanted certain things. Vincenzo would not give them. She had not thought it would become something that involved her directly. It was a Tuesday morning. She was walking from the hospital to the market, a route she took often. The winter light on the seafront was extraordinary, even when cold, low and silver and precise, and she became aware, gradually, over the course of 2 blocks, of a car. It moved at her pace, black. Not the same car as Vincenzo's. She noticed it the way she noticed certain things at the hospital. Not alarm exactly, but attention, the specific register of something that didn't fit the pattern. She stopped. The car stopped. She took out her phone. She had Vincenzo's number, and she had also, since October, a number that Enzo had given her one afternoon in the garden, without explanation, just, if you need anything. She called Enzo's number. Someone's following me, she said, when he picked up. A pause. Where are you? She told him. He said, keep walking, normal pace, don't stop again. She kept walking. 2 minutes later, a different car appeared. She recognized the particular grey of it, and the black car was still there, and then it wasn't. And she arrived at the market and bought what she'd come for and went back to the hospital and kept her hands very steady.
Enzo called her back 20 minutes later.
"It was Gennaro's people," he said. "Thank you," she said. "He'll want to know," Enzo said. She called Vincenzo before Enzo could. She was on her break in her office with the door closed. He answered on the first ring. She told him. There was a silence that had a specific quality, the particular density of a man making very precise calculations very quickly. "Are you at the hospital?" he said. "Yes." "Stay there until I send someone." "Vincenzo, I'm a grown woman who—" "Stay there," he said, not harshly, but with the weight of someone who has information she doesn't have and is not currently in a position to share it. "Please." The please was what did it. She said yes. He was there himself within the hour. He came into her office and looked at her with the intensity of someone who has been cataloguing the distance between himself and something important. "I'm fine," she said. "I know," he said. "This was Gennaro making a point," she said, "not a threat. In my world, Gianna, the distinction is academic." She looked at him. "What are you going to do?" "Handle it," he said. "Handle it how?" "In the way these things are handled," he said, and there it was, the edge of the world she was adjacent to, the one she had kept at careful distance, the one that now had sent a car to follow her. She thought, this is the line, this is where I have to decide. She looked at him. He was watching her with that attention, complete, focused, but also something else now. Something that was afraid, not of the Gennaros, of her. "What are you afraid I'll say?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment. "That it's too much," he said. She stood up. She crossed the office and stood in front of him. She took his hands. "It's a lot," she said. "It's not too much." "Gianna, but you have to talk to me," she said. "You can't manage me. You can't put me in a car and arrange my protection without telling me what I'm being protected from." If you told me, you'd trust me," she said. "And I need you to trust me, even if what you tell me is difficult." He looked at her hands in his. He looked up. "The Gennaro family," he said, "wants a territory I'm not giving them. Aldo has been making it personal. He thinks that demonstrating pressure on what I value will move me." "Will it?" The look he gave her then was so complete and so serious that she felt it in her chest. "No," he said. "Then don't let it," she said. "Gianna, you are what I value most," he said. Which was perhaps the most direct thing he had ever said to her. She held his hands tighter. "Then protect us both by handling it," she said. "And tell me what I need to know. And don't disappear into it." She looked at him. "Deal?" He looked at her for a long time. "Deal," he said. She kept his hands for a moment longer. Outside her office window, the grey January sky sat over Naples, and somewhere in the city, Aldo Gennaro was making calculations of his own, and she thought, I am a doctor in an emergency department, and I have learned that the most dangerous moment is always the one where you have the most information and the fewest good options. She thought, we'll find a way. It happened on a Thursday evening. She was at the villa, Marco was at his friend Tommaso's house for the night, a sleepover that Marco had been campaigning for since October, with the strategic persistence of someone who understood the value of wearing people down. The house was quiet in the particular way it was when Marco was absent, which was a different silence from the usual one, bigger somehow. She was reading in the sitting room. Vincenzo had been in his study for 2 hours. The call she'd heard him take at dinner had changed the quality of his attention, turned it inward, and she'd learned by now to give him the room he needed for the work that wasn't discussable. She read and listened to the house, and waited. He appeared in the doorway at 10.
He looked at her, and then crossed the room and sat beside her on the couch, not his usual chair, and she turned to face him. "Tell me," she said. "The Gennaro situation has accelerated," he said. "How?" "Aldo has made overtures to 2 other families," he said. "He's trying to build something, an alignment against the Esposito position." He paused. "It needs to be resolved, definitively. Tonight." She looked at him. "What does definitively mean?" He held her gaze. "A conversation," he said, "a direct one, between Aldo and me, in the presence of the other parties." "And if the conversation doesn't resolve it?" "It will resolve it," he said, "one way or another." She understood what one way or another meant in his world. She let herself know it. She didn't flinch from it. "Where will you be?" she asked. He told her. She filed it. She thought, "If he's not back by 3, I call Enzo." "I'll be back before midnight," he said. "If you're not, I will be." He looked at her steadily. "I am very good at this, Gianna." "I know," she said. "That doesn't mean I'm not going to sit here and count the minutes." Something moved in his face. He reached out and tucked her hair back, the same gesture, always the same gesture, as though he'd found the one physical vocabulary he trusted, and said, "When I come back, we're going to talk about something." "About what?" "About what this is," he said. "About what I want it to be." She looked at him. "What do you want it to be?" "Permanent," he said. The word sat between them, simple, final, like a promise given before the thing that might prevent it. "Go," she said. "Come back." He kissed her. Then he was gone. She did not count minutes. She read, and then she couldn't read, and she made tea and stood at the terrace door and looked at the city below with the January cold coming through the glass, and she thought about permanence and what it meant to choose something permanently. She thought about her mother. Rosa Ferretti had chosen, in 1987, to leave. She'd chosen protection over belonging. She'd chosen to run from the thing that had hurt her rather than stay and face it. And Gianna had been both the reason for the choice and the thing that suffered from it. Growing up between 2 worlds, never fully in either. She thought, "I'm the thing that happens when you don't run." At 11:45, headlights in the drive. She was at the door before he knocked. He came in, and she looked at him. All of him, a doctor's reflex, assessing. And he was intact, and looked at her with the particular look of a man who has done what needed doing, and is now somewhere on the other side of it. "It's done," he said. "Are you hurt?" "No." She put her hands on his face. He closed his eyes. "It's done," she said. "Yes." He put his hands over hers. Aldo understood the situation. The families understood. "It's done." She let out the breath she'd been holding for 2 hours. He was holding her then, both arms, pulling her against him in the way of someone who has needed this specific thing for hours, and is not pretending otherwise. "You said you wanted to talk about something," she said, against his shoulder. "Tomorrow," he said. "No," she said. "Now." He pulled back enough to look at her. His face was tired and open in the way that was only hers, the version she got that nobody else got. "I want to marry you," he said. She looked at him. "I know it's complicated," he said. "I know there are things about my life that are. I know what I'm asking you to accept. I know your mother ran from this city for exactly what I am. I know—" He stopped. "But I have never wanted anything the way I want you. Not power, not nothing. I want you to stay." She looked at his face. She thought about every conversation, every evening on the terrace, every morning with the light coming in, every difficult, true thing they'd said to each other, every time he'd looked for her in a room.
"Yes," she said. He stared at her. "Yes," she said again, clearly, precisely, in the way she did things when she was sure. "I'll stay. I'll marry you. Yes." He kissed her then, with an urgency that had nothing controlled about it, and she put her hands in his hair and kissed him back, and Naples moved outside the windows with its ordinary, miraculous noise, and the candle in the hall burned down to nothing, and they didn't notice. She called the hospital in the morning and asked for another week of her leave that she hadn't taken. Dr. Russo, who had spent the past 4 months watching her with the specific attention of a man who suspected she was not going back to New York, said, "Take 2. Marco found out at breakfast. He came home from Tommaso's at 9, deposited his overnight bag in the corridor with a trajectory that defied gravity, slid into the kitchen in his socks and said, "Gianna's here." Noting rather than observing, in the way of children who have accepted a new reality so thoroughly they forget it was ever new. Vincenzo said, "She's going to be here more permanently." Marco looked between them. The specific intelligence of a child who understands subtext applied itself. "Are you getting married?" he said. "Yes," Vincenzo said. Marco's face did several things in quick succession: surprise, calculation, and then a profound satisfaction that was clearly the result of a plan he had not revealed to anyone, but had evidently been running for some time. "Good," he said, and poured his cereal. Gianna laughed. She laughed for a long time, with the abandon of someone who has been wound very tight for a very long while and has only now fully understood that she can stop. She called Elena that afternoon. She'd thought about how to frame it. She'd thought about what Elena would feel, knowing who Gianna was marrying, knowing the weight of the name. She'd decided in the end on honesty, her standard approach to everything. Elena listened. She was quiet for a long time. Gianna could hear the heater of the flower shop and the distant sound of the street. "You're sure?" Elena said finally. "Yes," Gianna said. Another pause. "Your mother," Elena said, "spent her whole life afraid, and I think—" She stopped. "I think the fear was what killed her in the end, not the cancer. The fear underneath everything, the holding on." A pause. "She would have wanted you not to be afraid." "I'm not afraid," Gianna said. "No," Eleanor said, "I can hear that you're not." Something in her voice shifted. "Bring him to meet me," she said. "I want to look at his face." "I will," Gianna said. "And Gianna?" A pause. "Welcome home." She sat with the phone in her lap for a long time after. Outside, the January city moved in its complicated way, beautiful and difficult and absolutely itself. She thought about her mother in the kitchen, singing something low and wordless, and the smell of the city that she'd remembered without knowing she remembered it. She was home. She was genuinely, specifically, irreversibly home. She told Vincenzo about the call that evening. They were in the kitchen. She was cooking something that had a chance of success. He was watching with the absorbed attention he brought to everything, and she told him what Elena had said. He was quiet. "She wants to meet you," Gianna said. He was very still. "She has every reason not to want to meet me," he said. "She knows the difference," Gianna said, "between what you're responsible for and what your father was responsible for. She's a woman who's lived in Naples her whole life. She understands how inheritance works." He looked at her. "And what am I responsible for?" "A great deal," she said honestly. "Not that," he exhaled. "I would like to meet her," he said. "Good." She turned back to the stove. "She's going to look at your face very carefully." "Looking for what?" "She's 70 years old," Gianna said. "She'll know what she's looking for when she sees it." He came up behind her at the stove, put his hands on her shoulders, his mouth briefly to her temple. "And what will she find?" She leaned back into him. "I think she'll find," she said, "exactly what I found." "Which is?" "A man," she said, "who is trying." He turned her around. He looked at her face, the amber-ringed brown eyes, the stubborn jaw, the slight arch of an eyebrow that told him she meant what she said and was slightly amused by the weight it carried. "That's enough," he said. "For me," she said, "it's exactly enough." They drove to Pozzuoli on a Saturday in late January, the three of them. Marco had insisted, and neither adult had found the right argument, in a car that was not the imposing black sedan, but a smaller and more ordinary vehicle, which had been Gianna's suggestion, and which Vincenzo had agreed to with the slightly surprised expression of a man who has lived so long in a particular way of moving through the world that alternatives require adjustment. The flower shop was closed on Saturdays in January. Elena had opened it for them, which Gianna understood was an act of considerable courage, or considerable love, or probably both. Vincenzo stood in front of the shop for a moment before they went in. She looked at him. "Ready?" she said. "No," he said, honestly. "Good," she said. "Come anyway." Elena was behind the counter when they entered, and she looked at Vincenzo with the particular steadiness of a woman who has been preparing for a long time. He looked back. Gianna watched the two of them look at each other, the old woman with the florist's hands and the complicated history, the man who carried a name that had meant something specific and terrible. Vincenzo said, "Signora Mancini." His voice was very controlled. "I want to say something before anything else. What the Esposito name cost your family, and Gianna's, it was wrong. I can't undo it. I can only—" He stopped. "I can only tell you what I am, and let you decide what that's worth." Elena looked at him for a long moment. Then she came around the counter and looked up at his face. He was very tall, and she was very small, and she had to look up. And she took his face in her hands, the way very old women sometimes do, with the authority of age, and she looked at him. She held his face for a moment. Then she let go. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make coffee." Gianna exhaled. Marco, who had been waiting with barely contained energy, immediately found a display of autumn-dried flowers he found fascinating, and began interrogating Elena about them, which broke the solemnity of the moment in exactly the way solemnity should be broken, by a curious 9-year-old who couldn't see why adults were always standing still when there were interesting things to look at. They stayed 2 hours. Elena asked Vincenzo questions, not about his world, not about the Camorra, but about Marco, about the house, about how he spent his days, about what he read, about what he thought Naples would look like in 30 years. He answered everything directly. He did not perform. Gianna watched her aunt watching him,
and understood that Elena was doing the same thing she had done over months of evenings, reading the difference between what a man said and what was true. When they left, Elena embraced Gianna in the doorway. She smelled of chrysanthemums and coffee and warmth. "He's honest," Elena said, very quietly in her ear. "Yes," Gianna said. "And he looks at you like you're the most important thing in the room." "Frequently," Gianna said. "It's occasionally embarrassing." Elena pulled back and looked at her. Her eyes were very bright. "Don't be embarrassed," she said. "Let someone look at you like that." In the car, driving back along the coast road, with the bay enormous and silver beside them, and Marco asleep across the back seat with the boneless certainty of a child who has found the situation entirely satisfactory, Vincenzo reached across and took her hand. "Your aunt," he said, "is formidable." "Yes," she said. "She's going to be at the wedding." "Obviously." "And she's going to watch every person in the room. Also, obviously." He was quiet for a moment. She looked at his profile against the grey winter sea. "Are you happy?" she asked. He turned and looked at her. The look was long and direct and contained something she'd been learning to read for months, the specific quality of a man who has not been asked this question sincerely in a very long time, and is still deciding whether it's safe to answer. "Yes," he said. She turned back to the road. She smiled. He held her hand for the rest of the drive. Spring came to Naples in the specific way of things that have been overdue, all at once, and then completely, the city shaking off winter like a coat it was glad to be rid of. The terraces opened, the flowers at Eleanor's shop changed colours, the bay turned from silver to blue and stayed there. Gianna renewed her contract at Ospedale del Mare. Dr. Russo, who had suspected all along, shook her hand with the particular satisfaction of a man whose instinct has been confirmed. She moved into the villa in March. Not dramatically. She moved incrementally, the way the relationship had built, things appearing on shelves and in drawers, until the apartment in Chiaia was empty, and the question of where she lived had resolved itself entirely. Marco helped carry boxes with enormous enthusiasm and very little actual structural contribution, and was rewarded with a game of chess that he lost in 11 moves, while claiming it was a draw. She called New York on a Tuesday evening in April from the terrace, with the bay turning the particular gold of late afternoon, and Vincenzo's voice audible from inside the house, reading something to Marco with the reluctant good humour of a man who has discovered, to his own surprise, that he likes reading aloud. Her colleague Plia picked up on the third ring. "Tell me everything," Plia said. "I'm staying," Gianna said. A pause. "In Naples." "In Naples?" "Because of the case," Plia said, meaning the medicine. "Among other reasons," Gianna said. Another pause, a longer one. Plia, who had known her for 12 years and could read her through a phone line, said, "Oh my God, who is he?" Gianna looked at the bay. She thought about how to describe him, this complicated, private, precise, unexpectedly gentle man who had come to a hospital for his nephew and looked at her in an alley and had been looking ever since with a steadiness she'd been learning to receive. She thought about how to describe what he was, what his world was, the weight of the name and what it contained. She thought, Priya would need about 6 hours and several glasses of wine, and even then wouldn't fully understand. "Someone I met here," she said. "It's a long story." "I have time." "Maybe come and visit," Gianna said. "It's easier to explain in person."
They were married in May, not a large wedding, neither of them wanted large, and the guest list that would have satisfied the requirements of his world would have been a different kind of thing entirely. So they made a smaller ceremony in the garden of the villa, with the cypress trees and the bay beyond them, and Elena in the front row in a blue dress that made her look like she'd been painting for years. Marco walked Gianna in, because Marco had asked to, and she'd said yes, before fully registering what she was agreeing to, which he was aware of, and was the most satisfied she'd ever seen him. Father Benedetto, who had married at least 3 Esposito-adjacent ceremonies, and who was a man of the particular Neapolitan clergy who had long since stopped asking certain questions, performed a ceremony that was warm and real and contained no references to obedience, which Gianna had been clear about. Vincenzo looked at her the entire time. Not with nerves, he was not a nervous man, but with the totality of his attention that she'd come to know as his particular form of love, as though she was the only thing in the room that had resolution. She said yes, with complete clarity, in Italian, because she was Rosa Ferretti's daughter, and they were in Naples, and some promises needed to be made in the language they were made for. That evening, after the guests had gone, after Elena had kissed them both and cried with the quiet dignity of someone who had carried grief for so long that joy arrived as an almost physical relief, after Marco had fallen asleep in the garden chair and been carried to bed by Vincenzo with the ease of a man who had done this 1,000 times, they were alone on the terrace. The bay at night. Always the bay. Naples strung with its lights around the dark water, and Vesuvius against the sky, and the air smelling of jasmine and salt and something warm and permanent. She leaned against the railing. He stood behind her, his arms around her, his chin against her temple. "My mother would have been—" She stopped. "I don't know what she would have been." "Afraid," he said, not unkindly. "Yes," she said, "and eventually not, I think." She ran from the right thing, he said, and it brought her to the right place. And then you came back. She looked at the city. "Naples was always going to call me home," she said. "Were you always going to come?" She thought about the 2 times she'd almost come, the turns not taken, the weight of her mother's silence. She thought about a child in an alley, and a number dialed, and a voice that was low and certain. "Eventually," she said, "I think everything was always going to lead here." He tightened his arms. She felt his breath against her hair. Below them, Naples continued its ancient, complicated, beautiful existence. The city that had made both of them, that had taken things from both of them and given things back, that ran on complicated arrangements and also on jasmine and also on the particular grace of its light at this hour when everything was amber and ancient and looked like something worth keeping. She thought of her uncle, Giuseppe, who had refused to bend and paid everything for it. She thought of her mother, who had run and survived and given her a life. She thought of Elena in her flower shop, keeping faith across 40 years. She thought, I am the thing that happens at the end of all of it, the place where the grief stops and something else begins. Sleepless, Vincenzo said, against her hair. She considered the bay, the lights, the warm weight of him. Not tonight, she said. Below them, Naples smiled its complicated smile and carried them both in its ancient hands, and the night was warm and real and exactly right.